Our first speaker, Dr. Nicholas Spencer. I think you all will recognize pretty quickly that he's not from around here, but we've tried to make him feel welcome. Please come and talk to us about some history.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm not from around here. That's right. It's a real honour and a privilege to be here. When I wrote a book on the history of science and religion a few years ago, I wouldn't have dreamed that I'd be standing in the place where one of the chapters describes. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to be here because I've not been to America for about 45 years, which is shameful, really, but I've had a wonderful time here already. I've appreciated the hospitality. I've appreciated the palpable sense of civic pride. But I've most appreciated the fact that when I was buying a beer last night, I was asked for my ID. So if you folks think I look 21, I'll come back, okay? I'm going to talk to you about the road to Scopes. Not very much about the trial itself, because there are people in the room who know vastly more about the trial than I do. But in a sense, how we got here. And as part of that exploration of how we got here, what was this about? And how did it fit into the wider history of science and religion that stretches back many, many centuries? But I want to begin a couple of years after the trial, in 1927, on a different continent, in Europe. 1927 was the year of what was known as the Fifth Solvay Conference. The Solvay conferences had been going on for about 15 years in the early 20th century, and they'd seen some of the world's greatest physicists and chemists come together to talk about the major scientific developments of their day. During this fifth conference, which was a particularly important one, Albert Einstein was there. And he was introduced, it was held in Brussels, and he was introduced to a relatively young physicist and cosmologist who happened to be working in the city at the time, but hadn't been invited to the conference. His name was Georges Lemaitre. He wasn't eminent enough to be at the conference. He was a 33-year-old part-time lecturer at the Catholic University at Louvain. He had recently published a paper entitled A Homogeneous Universe of Constant Mass and Increasing Radius Accounting for the Radial Velocity of Extragalactic Nebulae. There's a catchy title, so there is one. It appeared in an obscure Belgian journal, and it argued, on the basis of Einstein's own work, that the universe was expanding, and indeed the speed of the galaxies was in proportion to their distance. In other words, the farther away they were, the faster they were travelling. And that seemed to suggest that once upon a time, they were all in one place. Or, in other words, that the universe had a beginning. Now, Einstein couldn't fault Georges Lemaitre's mathematics. He said they were flawless. But from the point of view of physics, he thought his ideas were abominable. There were some various elements of Lemaitre's theory that bothered Einstein, but one of them was the fact that Georges Lemaitre was a devout Catholic. Indeed, he was a priest. And the idea of an expanding universe with a beginning in time seemed to many people at the time a little bit suspect. Nesting beneath the flawless mathematics, they thought they could smell a theological rat. Now, Lemaitre was aware of this, but here's the interesting thing. He was personally very opposed to theologians appropriating his work to make a religious point. Indeed, as the years went on, they got more and more observational evidence to support Lemaitre's idea. And after the Second World War, Lemaitre would intervene and advise the Pope's scientific advisor to tell the Holy Father not to make sweeping theological claims about the Creator, simply on the basis of physics. Now, back before the war, Lemaitre wasn't important enough to make those interventions publicly, but he was still sometimes called upon to make comments on the relationship between science and religion. And in one article for the New York Times in 1933, he wrote robustly that neither St. Paul nor Moses had the slightest idea of relativity. The writers of the Bible were illuminated, more or less, some more than others, on the question of salvation. On other questions, they were as wise or as ignorant as their generation. Now, Lemaitre didn't make this up. This is a venerable idea in the history of science and religion that we can trace back at least 1,500 years. To take a couple of examples, John Philoponus was one of the most important philosophers of the late antique world, so about 5th, 6th century. He commented extensively and approvingly on Aristotle, who was the scientist at the time. And he was an ardent opponent of those Christians. There weren't many. He was a Christian himself, but he was an ardent opinion of those Christians who argued the world was flat. There were a handful, and it's been much mythologized after that, but there were some. John wrote a scathing attack on their views, condemning what he considered to be their bad science, but also what he thought was their bad theology. He wrote, "No one considering the systematic treatment of nature by later writers is going to ask Moses' scripture what has been thoroughly researched on these subjects by specialists. That was not excellent Moses' intent. Rather, excellent Moses, according to John, was chosen by God to lead people to knowledge of God, not of nature." 1,000 years after John Philoponus, more famously, Galileo Galilei wrote a public letter to the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany in which he defended Copernicanism and justified its compatibility with Holy Scripture on the basis of the Church's teaching itself. Galileo quoted a number of theologians, most famously St. Augustine, and he explained that Augustine had said that even pagan philosophers could acquire conclusive reasons and observations about the world. And Galileo famously remarked, although he was actually making a quote from someone else, that the intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how one goes to heaven and not how heaven goes. Now, however legitimate that particular division of labour is, it's fair to say over the next few hundred years it was more or less completely ignored. Indeed, the history of science and religion, from about the death of Galileo, so from about 1650, right the way up to about 1850, seems to have been one big exercise in ignoring Galileo's advice. So Europe erupted in religious wars in the 17th century, with Christians fighting and killing one another over theological ideas. And so after that, a number of European thinkers sought to get ideas about God which circumvented these really contested theological battles between Protestants and Catholics. They wanted to understand who God was, but they wanted to do so without necessarily going through the scriptures, but rather going to what they considered to be a less tainted source of knowledge, in other words, nature. And so from about the 1670s onwards, scientists, or natural philosophers, as they were called at the time, offered, quote, a demonstration of the being and attributes of God from more or less significant aspects of the natural world. Most famously, Isaac Newton, who really revolutionised physics and cosmology at the end of the 17th century, was an extremely pious, although very eccentrically pious individual, who wrote far more about theology than he ever did about science, but was insistent that his scientific ideas were a valuable defence of Christian truth in the face of atheism. and other lesser scientists picked up from Newton and then applied the same logic to everything, and I mean everything. And there were books of theology defending and defining the idea of God from having studied silkworms and thunder and frogs and mussels, everything. It's a very strange idea that we believe that the Enlightenment, this period in 18th century Europe, was a period of godlessness, when on the contrary, this was the century when hundreds and hundreds of people were studying nature and saying, you can know the exact definition of the Creator from studying flowers. Unfortunately, this didn't end well. In the early 19th century, about a century before the Scopes trial, when this tradition was at its zenith, the philosopher and theologian William Paley proved the existing character of God from nature definitive. However, as we all know, a few years later, Charles Darwin came along, and he drew on a mountain of evidence to show that Paley's arguments were wrong, and that the nature of the natural world was better explained by a process of natural selection. And for many people, that's it. That's the story. For many people, you can draw a straightforward line from what Darwin first said in his notebooks in 1837, and then he said out loud in The Origin of Species in 1859, all the way from that to what happened at the Scopes trial 66 years later. And that's all we need to do by way of explanation. Paley tried to prove God from nature, Darwin disproved Paley, therefore Darwin disproved God. And that just took people a long time to acknowledge that, in effect, the argument was that Darwin caused the Scopes. But it's worth clearing up a few major errors in that chain of reasoning before we go on to here. Firstly, Darwin himself was never an atheist. He was sure that it was possible to accommodate belief in God with his theory, and that was a view he held right up to the end of his life. In 1879, he told one correspondent that, quote, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. A few years later, the year before he died, Darwin wrote to the philosopher William Graham about Graham's book called The Creed of Science, and he said, you have expressed my inward conviction, though far more vividly and clearly than I could have done, that the universe is not the result of chance. Darwin did delay the publication of The Origin of Species by about 20 years, as it happens, but he primarily did that because he wanted to gather a truly enormous amount of information so that he could put what he knew was going to be a controversial theory beyond doubt, or beyond reasonable doubt. He was not delaying his publication, as some people have claimed, simply because he was scared of the Church's response. That's the first important correction. The second important correction was Darwin was scared of the response, and he was partly scared of the response, because Darwin was part of the elite class of Victorian Britain, and he was worried about what the book would do to his social standing. But he was actually more worried about what the book would do to his standing as a scientist. And he was most worried about the scientific response, and he was right to do so, because at the time there were many holes in his argument, and weirdly the argument became less convincing as the century went on. Things then subsequently changed. There were 6 editions of The Origin of Species, each one Darwin slightly revising the text from the edition beforehand, and he did so because he was trying to accommodate the criticisms that other scientists had levelled at his theory, and in the process he slowly watered down his theory. So there was a delay there, but it had nothing to do with science versus religion. It was science versus science. And this is an incredibly important point to make. However much through history religion might oppose science, and I argue in
book magisterium that actually is far less than we think. But however much religion might have opposed science, it's nothing compared to the amount of science has opposed science. That's what science does, and it's very important to recognise that, particularly in the context of when Darwin published the book. Third point, it's true that Victorian Britain did undergo a crisis of faith, but in spite of the popular view, that had very little to do with Darwinism or evolution. The thing that really bothered Victorian Britons was what was then known as German higher criticism, and it was subsequently known as liberal biblical criticism. Liberal biblical criticism sought to treat the Bible like any other historical text, and then found gaps and holes in its accounts. Vastly more controversial than Darwin's Origin of Species was a book published the following year that virtually nobody has heard about today, and pretty much nobody has read, called Essays and Reviews, which was a collection of 7 essays by Anglican clerics who introduced liberal biblical criticism to the general public. That was what bothered Victorian Britons far more than Darwinism. Fourth point, although many people were disbelieving and some very angry at Darwin and Darwinism, in a decade or two after the idea was first published, they got over it reasonably quickly. In the words of historian James Moore, who was the author of the definitive book tracing the reception of Darwinism in Britain and America in the 19th century, with but few exceptions, the leading Christian thinkers in Great Britain and America had come to terms quite readily with Darwinism and evolution. It's worth remembering that Darwin himself was buried in Westminster Abbey. They didn't do that to heretics in Victorian Britain. Fifth and finally, in terms of these corrections, as James Moore quote suggests, this was as much the case in America as it was in Britain. Indeed, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that prior to about 1900, it wasn't very much of an issue in the US. Now, to be clear, many people, including many evangelicals, didn't like the theory and many didn't accept it. But rejection was a campaigning issue, only really for a very small minority of people in the 19th century. William Jennings Bryan himself never believed in the theory, but nor, for much of his life, was the campaigning issue for him. Quote, I do not carry the doctrine of evolution as truth, as some do, but I do not mean to find fault with you if you want to accept the theory. He said in 1904. Indeed, he was even prepared to countenance it, to countenance evolution in plant life and animal life and rights. He admitted, he said, albeit with some very big caveats. So what happened? And in particular, why has this relationship between science and religion, which has been comparatively harmonious for most of its history, albeit with some ups and downs in the middle of the 19th century, why did it explode in 1925? Well, to answer that, it's helpful to go back to what George Lemaitre said to the New York Times. The writers of the Bible, he said, were illuminated more or less on the question of salvation. Galileo, Duchess Christina, the scriptures are really about the question of how to go to heaven. This, I argue, in magisterium is really at the heart of the matter. Let me put it this way, and paying all due respect to the American paleobiologist Stephen Jay Gould, from whom I stole the title Magisterium from my book, although in all fairness he stole it from Catholic teaching, so I don't feel that guilty. Christian belief can and should, for the most part, see the ground of how the material world works. That is not its magisterium, its area of expertise. Very importantly, This doesn't mean ceding ground in the discussion of what value we place on the material world. It doesn't mean ceding the ground of the philosophical underpinnings of the methods of science. As it happens, Christianity was very important in developing those philosophical justifications for the study of science. But when it comes to the basic question of how things tick, that is not religion's magisterium. On the other side of the contract, much as some scientists protest otherwise, scientists have to cede the ground on the question of the existence of God. To be clear again, this doesn't mean that science has nothing to contribute to that debate. It surely does. But it simply contributes to that debate as part of a much bigger debate that brings in philosophical and ethical and existential questions into this massive central question of the existence of God. What science cannot do is answer authoritatively on this question, because science is what known as an empirical discipline. And you can't adjudicate on the existence or otherwise of a God who is by definition not part of the creation, who is other, simply through the scientific method. The American theologian and philosopher David Hart puts it quite well when he said too much of the science versus God debate simply doesn't get this distinction, and it consists of the equivalent of questioning the reality of Tolstoy on the basis that he doesn't appear anywhere in the pages of Anna Karenina. It doesn't work like that. So I would argue that at this deep level, the magisterium of science and religion are different and distinct. But different and distinct does not mean, as Stephen J. Gould claimed, that they're completely non-overlapping. They are not completely separate, because there remains one very important part where those two different magisteria overlap. The Methodist line, I keep on coming back to, the writers of the Bible illuminate on the question of salvation, makes the assumption that humans are the kind of creatures for whom the idea of salvation makes any sense at all. Science may not be able to adjudicate definitively on whether God or heaven or an afterlife exists, and it has next to nothing to say on the efficacy of the atonement or the truth of the Nicene Creed. But it can, and it does, make a judgment about what kind of creatures we are. And by implication, whether we're the kind of creatures for whom salvation, or going to heaven in Galileo's formulation, or eternal judgment, or whatever you want to call it, whether we're the kind of creatures for whom that makes sense. Time and again, in the history of the relationship between science and religion, the two magisteria got most entangled, most interesting, and sometimes most angry when both magisteria have made statements, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, about the nature of the human. Or, to be more specific still, when one of those magisteria had made statements about the nature of the human that were supposed to be authoritative and exclusive. In other words, humans are nothing but, or humans are only. There should be a klaxon that goes out every time you hear the word only in these discussions, or nothing but in these discussions. Because when they do, that's when the tension arises. And that is how we get from Darwin in 1859 to Scopes in 1925. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. The year after Darwin's book was published, there was a famous debate in Oxford. It was basically our equivalent of the Spurs trial. It was an encounter between Thomas Henry Huxley, who was famous as Darwin's bulldog, and Bishop Soapy Sam Wilberforce. The two men faced one another in the library of the New University Museum of Oxford in June 1860. Now, in theory, the two of them were there to respond to a paper by a lecturer called John Draper on the intellectual development of Europe, but it was a pretty tedious paper. It was a hot afternoon, a lot of people fell asleep, and in reality, everyone knew that the debate was going to be about Charles Darwin's theory that had been published 9 months earlier. Now, the encounter is famous for Huxley's alleged quip about preferring to be an ape, going to have an ape than a bishop for his ancestor. But until recently, we never actually known what was said there, because the report was a bit covered only in a little bit of detail in the magazine called The Afternoon. There were some articles, some letters. Nobody really knew what happened, and then one very sharp-eyed scholar of the local newspapers and the history of being digitised at the moment. One scholar was digitising a copy of the Oxford Chronicle and Bucks Gazette. And he spotted there was an account of this fight between Huxley and Wilberforce. He finally got some idea of what was actually said there. Maybe the Q&A, I'll tell you what I'll tell you now. What it does show, what this transcript does show, is that for Huxley, the real debate was about authority. He had begun his remarks by alleging the undesirability of contesting a scientific subject involving nice ideas before a general audience, which is not really the way you expect to win a crowd over in the first instance. And he was indignant that an amateur clerical naturalist, was an amateur, like Wilberforce, should consider himself capable of adjudicating on these matters. Holcomb authorities and other issue which had to part cruise at the time. On the other side, for Wilberforce, the issue was about humanity. Wilberforce, a bit like Brian, was willing to countenance evolution in certain limited circumstances, say relating to plants and quote-unquote the lower animals. But he could not extend that to humans. The transcript shows he was almost hysterical in making this point. It is a most degrading assumption that man, who in many respects partook of the highest attributes of God, was a mere development of the lowest forms of creation. He could scarcely trust himself to speak upon the subject, so indignant did he fear the idea. This was an Anglican bishop getting really, really cross. That was the issue for Wilberforce. It robbed humans, as he saw it, their eternal dignity. They became, from Wilberforce's understanding of darkness, humans became the kind of beings for whom salvation was material or impossible. It was a strangely similar position to the one that Brian had taken before World War I. As I mentioned, he was prepared to countenance evolution of plant and animal life with some caveats, but one of those caveats was that it could not be countenanced up to the highest form of animal, i.e. not humans. That was a push too far. Now, if this strikes some of us today as a bit oversensitive, it is worth recalling how the theory was being used at the time. I guess this is as central point as any as I'm making. Evolution is rarely only about evolution. In fact, it's almost never only about evolution. Now, an example of this, Darwin, in case you haven't picked up, I'm a big fan of Charles Darwin, both as a scientist and as a human being. But no man is without sin, and even Darwin. Darwin came from a strong anti-slavery family, had two families. He hated slavery and the institution. He was a convinced monogenist. He was determined to argue that all humans came from the same family, rather than being different species. But even given that, for all that Darwin was passionately committed to monogenesis, to the common descent of all humans, the brotherhood of man, and for all that his book dismissed ideas of racial fixity or essentialism, as it was known. His book, More Than the Descent of Man, which was about 10 years later, his theory left no doubt that some groups were superior to others, and that biology, for all its variability, was still basically destiny. He quoted with the essayist William Gregg in his book, In Descent of Man, on how, quote, the careless, squalid, unaspiring Irishman multiplies like rabbits. He was subsequently taken to task for this by a polite Irish correspondent who wrote in 1977 very politely saying, The Descent of Man is a great scientific work and it is definitely to go to all time and to all languages, but the passage to which I refer you is quite unworthy of such a book and a view. But there was worse than casual abuse of Irishmen. In the same book, Darwin wrote entirely in his own voice, quote, at some future period, not very distant as measured by the centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. Had Darwin known how those ideas would be used as a justification by generations of racists and eugenicists, the abolitionist humanitarian Darwin would be horrified. But it was nonetheless a very revealing and unfortunate statement. And it was this fear that what evolution revealed was a permanent hierarchy among human beings based on race and class. That it was a hierarchy that was natural and therefore immutable. And that this was a world in which might was right and biology was destiny. And it was an idea that revealed that the human creature was not destined for God or eternity, but only for the grave and obscurity. It was this fear that hovered in the background of the Scottish trial. And it was a justifiable fear. In September 1906, William Temple Hornby, the first director of the New York Zoological Museum, put the Otter Wenger, a 23-year-old Congolese pygmy, on display in the monkey house. Wenger had been a survivor of a massacre in the Belgian Congo in which he lost his wife and his children. And he was put in the same cage as the orangutan called Wuhan, next to a cage with a gorilla called Dinah, and had a sign placed out outside the cage accurately describing his age, height, weight, and provenance. The exhibit drew an enormous crowd and lots of press coverage. The pygmy was not much taller than the orangutan, their heads are much alike, and both grin in the same way when pleased, observed the New York Times. Not everyone was so impressed. The display drew a furious response from the Coloured Baptist Ministers' Conference, with the Reverend James Gordon complaining that our race is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. He went on, we think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. The same point that Galileo was making, the same point that John Philip Marsh was making, the same point that George Lemaitre was making. What kind of creature are we? Are we worthy of being considered as human beings with souls? Other non-black ministers agreed. The person responsible for this degrades himself as much as he does the Africans as the pastor of the Calvary Baptist Church. Instead of making a beast of this little fellow, we should be putting him in school for the development of such powers as God gave him. We send our missionaries to Africa to Christianize the people, and then we bring one here to brutalize him. Holiday was unrepentant. I'm a believer in the Darwinian theory, he replied, and demonstrated such specimens purely as an ethnological exhibit. Purely as an ethnological exhibit. The New York Times reported him. The Reverend Coloured Brother should be told that evolution is now taught in the textbooks in all schools, and that it is no more debatable than the multiplication tables. And the paper's readers some of them concurred. The exhibit should be praised for its scientific character. One respondent wrote. It is to be hoped that it will, quote, help our clergymen to familiarise themselves with the scientific point of view, so absolutely foreign to many of them. The concerns behind the trial here were obviously different, but they had similarities. G.W. Hunter's book, Civic Biology, on which the Scopes trial was essentially based, taught evolution, as we all know. It taught the evolution of humans, without apology or reservation. And in his chapter on heredity and variation, Hunter explained how sexual immorality, alcoholism, epilepsy, feeble-mindedness, and other social problems were fundamentally biological issues. Quote, hundreds of families, such as those described above, exist today, spreading disease, immorality, and crime to all parts of this country. The cost to society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals or plants become parasitic on other plants or animals, these families have become parasitic on society. They not only do harm to others by corrupting, stealing, or spreading disease, but they are actually protected and cared for by the state out of public money. Largely for them, the poorhouse and the asylum exists. They take from society, but they give nothing in return. They are true parasites. This was a biology textbook, remember. And if biology defined the social problem as a biological problem, it also suggested the remedy, as the relevant chapter in Hunter's book titled it. Quote, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. This wasn't simply empty verbiage. Eugenics was on the march in America. Indiana became the first state to pass a forced sterilisation law in 1907, and dozens of states followed, sterilising criminals, drunks, promiscuous women, morons and imbeciles, which were scientific definitions of intelligence, as well as a number of poor and by disabled black citizens. Some states resisted the movement. Tennessee never passed a sterilisation law, though bills were proposed. But the great Oliver Wendell Holmes, who sat on the Supreme Court for 30 years, nonetheless spoke for his era when he famously declared in the case of the sterilisation of the mentally defective Carrie Buck, 2 years after the Scopes trial, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Before this was bad enough, the eruption of the Great War in Europe in 1914, in which American servicemen were fighting from 1917, seemed to underline how, in other ways, Darwinism had pan out. The evolutionist Vernon Kellogg wrote a book entitled Headquarters Nights, which seems to offer first-hand evidence of the link between evolution and violent German militarism. He was based in Brussels during the war, and he was originally a pacifist, but Kellogg had multiple conversations with German officers in which they revealed to him the role that the Darwinian struggle for survival played in justifying their belligerence. Kellogg abandoned his pacifism and he wrote his book. William James Bryan read the book. Disproportionately from poorer, less well-educated backgrounds, the fundamentalists who fought at the Scopes trial could still tell the difference between social Darwinism, eugenics, and Christian ethics. Sparing Genesis and geology was nothing when it came to squaring the Sermon on the Mount with the survival of the fittest. I don't want to go over the conclusion that the Scopes trial wasn't about evolution. Of course it was. Moreover, putting my cards fully on the table in this narrow matter, I'm on the side of Clarence Darrow, been a fully paid up Darwinian and evolutionist. But battles over evolution are only very rarely only about evolution, and this one certainly wasn't. In the 19th century, the battle over evolution had been about partly the question of who gets to decide on these issues. It had been about the intellectual and academic status of natural theology, natural philosophy, and natural philosophers and scientists, and that's an important part of the story that I had to part for reasons of time. But, coming to that, it had also been about, arguably primarily about the nature of the human. Who or what are we? And how important or valuable are we? And as evolution left the realms of science and entered the realms of politics and social policy towards the end of the century, that battle over the nature of the human became very live and very bitter. And the explosive conclusion came here 100 years ago. But the truth is that this moment, every bit as explosive as the Oxford debate in 1860 or the trial of Galileo in 1632, they were exceptions to the general rule of comparative harmony in the long history of science and religion. Where there have been flashpoints, they have mostly been about the nature of the human. Or, more specifically, the real flashpoint has been when either magisterium, honestly it's usually a scientific magisterium, when either magisterium has made a statement about the nature of the human that was proposed to be authoritative and exclusive. Humans are only X, and I say this authoritatively in a way that you can't challenge. It has been when one discipline has said that humans are only machines, as the French philosopher Leclerc said in the 18th century. Or humans are only mammals. Or humans are only evolved primates. Or, as Freud would have it in the 20th century, humans are only our subconscious urges. Or as some Darwinians say, humans are only our genes. When that word only has been inserted there and said with authority, that's when things kick off. And I will conclude by saying that in an age in which we are told that humans are only information, or only data, or only processing power, or only algorithms, we have not heard the end of this particular debate. Humans always need to learn from history, and that includes particularly history, science and religion. Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments?
Question. Point out some of the apparent myths that we now believe about the original history surrounding controversy around Darwinism. It was less about science and theology so much as it was about what is said about humans and whether scientists and I guess theologians, for lack of a better word, are treating each other as exclusive magisterium. So, would you say that up until the time of the Scopes trial, that was really the issue, was intruding upon each other's turf, not so much a conflict of science versus religion?
So, good question. Thank you. Did everyone hear that?
No.
So, it's a question about whether the battle between science and religion, or the tension between science and religion, had been, up until the Scopes trial, a battle about different professionals that were encroaching on each other's territory. It absolutely was. So, if we go back to the beginning of the 19th century, in Europe certainly, and you wanted to find somebody who was doing science, 3 times out of 4, they would be an ordained Anglican clergyman doing it either in Oxford, Cambridge, or in their rectory. Science was, the word science has been used forever, it's a Latin word, but it wasn't used in the way that we use it. Natural philosophy was its enterprise, and this was the kind of thing that was done by leaders themselves, who qualified theologians, effectively. And what happened, it was thought in the other end of the century, science would be done by a credentialed, independent scientist in a lab somewhere. It had been professionalised in the 19th century. And so much of the actual particular fight was about who gets the authority to adjudicate on these matters. That was why Huxley was so crossed by Wilberforce, because Wilberforce was an exceptionally intelligent man, and he was a good natural philosopher, but he wasn't a scientist. And he's actually coached in his answers by Rhea County, who was a scientist. Huxley was indignant that this amateur should be occupying the turf that Huxley thought was his, and Huxley himself did a lot of work to try and professionalise science. The word scientist was only invented in English in 1834, and it's an example of this thing being professionalised. So, as much as it's about human, and what it's going to talk about, actually, it's a professional dispute. It's back off my professional territory because I'm the expert here. And that changed, and there's quite a few people embittered. If you look at the records of the British Association for the Development of Science, which is the big annual jamboree, I'm going to get the figures wrong, but prior to about 1850, those meetings had almost always been presided over by a clergyman. And after 1850, that got less and less and less. So by the end of the century, there were certainly believers there, but it wasn't a subset of a religious thing. So that professional thing, absolutely right, that really is going on.
It's more of a turf war.
It is a bit of a turf war, yeah. I don't want to, there's a brilliant historian of science and religion who I dedicate, called John Henry Brooke, who was a lovely guy, who worked on sort of 50 years or so. And he has this lovely line about Darwin, in which he says, we should try to avoid pigeonholing the man who would pigeonhole pigeons. And John reminded me in writing the book, he said, you have these things running through it, but don't pretend that everything is about one thing, because that's been popular with science and religion in the past. People say it's about one thing, it's about war, conflict, and it isn't. So I think it definitely is about the human, it definitely is about the turf war, but it's messy and complex as well. So I take two.
Yeah. Scientists, like anybody, have their own, prejudices and cultural heritage baggage that they bring with them. And you quoted a number of people who expressed these things that aren't necessarily, based on good science. But then you also brought in eugenics and these things. And yet, at that time, eugenics wasn't even talked about at the trial, or racism. And yet we know now, with the work from Paul Lamar and others, that Brian, his wife, many of the evangelicals were very prominent eugenicists. They supported it, and yet they didn't support evolution and tradition. So I think that there's a disconnect there that by conflating them, that many people do, I think is unfair and just not accurate with the historical thing. Look at currently what politicians like Trump are saying about people from other countries, and they're bringing in bad blood and stuff like this. This is a heritage that's separate from the scientific study of evolution.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll take a couple points and come back to that. Thank you, sir.
How did the tension between Darwinism and science with religion vary depending on from like Europe and the United States, and also within the United States? Big city versus small rural communities, for instance.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll take three. So, President.
Yeah, I saw the recording of yourself in a conversation with Stephen Pinker. It went on for about an hour or so, the psychologist. And I thought it was just an outstanding model of a civil discussion of people that strongly held very different opinions, expressed those opinions assertively. And I just think it should be watched by many people that unfortunately we don't have discourses like that as much as we should in our country. But I was wondering if you stayed up with Stephen Pinker, either professionally or personally, if there's been any further communication since then.
in reverse order. Thank you very much. Very kind of you to say. I was seriously nervous. I was seriously nervous because everyone else who did a picture is like nobody knew who I was. And I did admire Stephen Pinker. I would say I'm on record, I can't say at the time. I think as an intellectual historian, he's as good as thinks he is. I think that the last part of that book, Enlightenment Now, that we're talking about, is seriously thin. And I wrote a couple of long reads in response to that book, and also his Dawes book on violence, which again is very impressive, but I think it's accepted to him. He didn't respond, so we're not good buddies. But if he's listening to this, I'll have to have another conversation. Thank you. Location, I think that's really important. There's a historian science with David Minister who has written a book called Science in Its Place, Putting Science in Its Place, and he makes exactly that point about where the science goes on. It tends to make a big difference to what form science and religion debate takes. So the classic example of this is France in the 18th century. So you have France and Britain, both leading European nations in the 18th century, intellectually, scientifically. In England, Britain, that science is kind of embraced by the establishment. Scientists are Anglican clerics, there is the Royal Society, which is the 1660s. It is effectively baptized, socially and politically baptized. And that was one of the reasons why there was very little tension between science in the 18th century. Actually, I argue in the book that the problem was to the other extreme. It treated it like a perfectly harmonious marriage without sufficient kind of questioning. In France, the authorities came down very, very hard on any kind of intellectual enterprise that is to be heterodox. And even Cartesianism, which is based on Descartes, it slowly creeps in the 18th century. But there is a constrictive, oppressive, authoritarian control over people who are doing science. And that means that a lot of people doing science basically use the science as a way, weaponize it as a way to attack the authorities. And that was why the world's great atheists in that period of time were from France. Because they wanted to, for example, pick up debates about the origins of life and for the complex and reason use that, weaponize that against the church, because the church is perfectly aligned. Germany is different. Germany is a fragmentary kingdom, separate kingdoms at the time, so there isn't that kind of potential for oppression there. I don't really know enough about American history in that period, but where people are doing it is so important, because I wrote a history of atheism 10 or so years ago. It was an interesting subject to do, and one of the points I made is that there is no such thing as a single atheist. There's lots of different kinds of atheists, because where you are an atheist matters hugely, and more importantly, what conclusions you draw from it. Because there is no God is fine, that's acceptable as a kind of conclusion in academic seminar. But if you go out to the real world, people want to know there is no God, and therefore what? And therefore, what is the value of the human? How should we run society? And so, different locations. So location is you're right, so important to how a country forms ideas. Your question, sir, yeah, really good, and you're absolutely right in that tying eugenics too closely to Darwinism doesn't convey clearly enough how widespread eugenicist views were, and how some people who were fully rejecting Darwinism could hold to eugenics. What I would say, I do take that point, is that one of the things that gave eugenics the momentum it did in the early 20th century was that it was scientific. It's common, just in case anyone was considered pseudo-scientific. It drew so much of its authority from the idea that it was based on a scientific set of disciplines. Whether Darwinian or not was debatable, but the authority behind it was scientific. So you had plenty in the UK, in England, you had plenty very liberal Anglican clergymen who were eugenicists, because they thought this was a way to improve society, and science justified it. But you're right, there's a more complex picture, and there's no idea at all.
Yes, you just brought up Anglicans. How did the fact that Britain was basically Anglican not ensure but make relationships between the sciences and religion more compatible or civil or whatever?
Yeah, so it was how, correct me if I've got this, Ms. Ricky talk, how did the fact that Britain, England, was an Anglican country, or had an established Church of England, affect the relationship between science and religion over this time? Broadly speaking, very positively. I don't mean to suggest that there's anything kind of unique about Anglicanism that makes it a wonderful, fertile soil for science, but it was more the fact that since the late 17th century, Anglicanism had been religiously hegemonic, being the dominant, although not exclusive religious group, and two of the supreme intellectual titans of that period, Isaac Newton and John Locke, were both Anglicans, and very devout in their own scientific ways. And a kind of message that came through that was, well, if Isaac Newton, who was a faithful communicant of the Church of England, and so much more intelligent than any of us, can see and argue that his theories are compatible with his beliefs, and if John Locke, whose letters concerning toleration, letters concerning government, whose wrote on human understanding, a titanic figure, chooses to live his last hours of life with a amorous passion reading from the Psalms, and actually justifies so much of what he did on the basis of the scriptures. If these great figures see the compatibility of this new intellectual endeavour, science or political theory, as compatible, who am I to say otherwise? And so they create this kind of culture of positivity, like a culture of encouragement that I mentioned earlier, because so much of the science, and in England in the 18th century, run by clergymen, the whole thing has this kind of a theological imprimatur of approval on it. So it certainly helps, and it's interesting why really from the end of the 17th century all the way up to post-Darwin, it's been very, by and large, very harmonious landscape on that front.
I hate to cut it off. Please continue to talk with Dr. Spencer. We need to break and get ready for the next session. Thank you so much.